you. Adam,
Hello.
thrilled to be here with you.
Thank you for doing this. Thank you all for coming.
Adam Nagourney, author of The Times, How the Newspaper of Record Survived Scandal, Scorn, and the Transformation of Journalism. A modest disclaimer, back when both of us had hair, we worked for the same institution. I spent some very happy years at The Times as a staff editor at the op-ed page in the late 80s and early 90s, and then returned in 98 to do some stuff, winding up as the op-ed page editor and the deputy editorial page editor, where I worked with Adam's sister-in-law, who is really one of the best copy editors on the face of the earth. So Adam, why don't we start at the beginning? What made you want to write this?
So I guess the most important thing is I always wanted to work at the New York Times. If you had met me in college when I was working for the school newspaper at SUNY Purchase, I would tell you I wanted to work for the Times. I would tell you that I want to cover national politics for the Times, and there's evidence of that. If you run into people from that class, they'll come and tell you about that. And I had also read Dee Talise's, to this day, legendary book about the Times. And I think that was one of the reasons that I wanted to work there. It just made it seem like such a cool, important, and self-important place. We could talk about that a little bit. And I thought about it for a long time, and I wasn't sure how realistic it was to do it while working at the Times for all the obvious reasons. And then at a certain point in, I think, 2015, I decided, this is what I want to do. This is a book of passion. I think it needs to be done. I think I could bring a sort of, I'll leave it to people who read it, dispassion and analysis to it to tell the story. And I just sort of went out and brought the book proposal around. There was a lot of interest in it, and off to the races.
So on that, what is the strategy for writing about a place where you work? That's tough.
Yeah, I think the way it worked is that I am almost entirely writing a history. The book ends in 2016. So with a few exceptions, everyone that I'm writing about, when I mean few, I mean like two, are gone, are retired, which meant that I didn't have to think about what are they going to think about what I'm writing, how it could affect my career, but also just the awkwardness of interviewing people who I work for. The exception was the current publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, who I interview in his previous incarnations. I don't talk about him much at all, about him as a publisher. I think that if I was going to write about the post-2016 period, after Trump was elected, obviously, it would have been a lot more complicated. But because I did it like this, I think it was more manageable. Again, I leave it to people to read to see whether they think I pulled that off or not. It wasn't easy. It kept me up at night.
But so that was your strategic decision,
Yeah.
ending in 2016 before Trump becomes president.
And make it a history, write about people who are gone. The other advantage of that is when people are out of the paper, this is the thing about a history versus a contemporary book, they're much more likely to be candid in talking to me about things. They have no obvious, necessary political edge, and they're much more likely to share with me documents and memories and things that I don't think I know I would not get if I were talking to people who were working there.
I think that's one thing that really comes through in this book, and that it is, you think of the Times as a monolith. You think of the paper itself, you think of what you see on the app, you think of every encounter you have with it. Mm-hmm. But really, it is this, it's a monolith made by humans,
right? Of
humans. And this book makes that very clear. And the book, in many ways, is kind of a matrix of relationships. It's can be father to son in the Sulzbergers, who own the paper. It can be publisher to editor-in-chief. It can be editor-in-chief to editors. It can be editor to writer. And those relationships really define this thing that we all look at every day. Maybe you could talk about a few of the key relationships that unspool over the course of the book.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. I think the thing that makes the Times so interesting, important, successful, and utterly neurotic are all the people who are there and the kind of people who are there. This sort of community of people who are brilliant and insecure, right? It's just this very weird combination of personality traits. And there are a series of characters that we follow through the book. One is Arthur Sulzberger Jr., AG's father. and how he deals with his executive editors through all kinds of things, all kinds of crises that really sort of affected the paper. He ended up having to dismiss 2 executive editors over the course of his career, which, as you know, is a lot. And because for a variety of reasons, which we could talk about, they just didn't work out. And I think what's interesting about it is that, when I first started writing this book, people said to me, you have to deal with the legacy of Arthur Sulzberger Jr. I'm sure you worked with him when you were there, obviously. And when I first started writing the book in 2016, I wasn't sure what I was going to say because he had gone through these 2 executive editors. The paper had the problem with the Judy Miller and the Iraq coverage. I'm short-handing, I can expand on this. The plagiarism scandal of Jason Blair. The paper had some difficult times. But, and I think this is the through line of this book, Arthur Jr. always sort of had a sense, whether it was instinctual or what, that the paper had to move into the digital world. And you can find this from these early speeches that he would give, where he would say stuff like, I don't care how my readers get their information, I don't care if we beam it into their brains. He understood that the paper was not necessarily going to be a paper through the course of his career. And I think he kind of nudged various executive editors through that. Some of that was difficult because I think older, more traditional legacy journalists sort of resisted the idea of the newspaper as being this print-on-print entity. Mm-hmm. And I think some of them got pushed out because of that. Howell Raines, who was here today, I think you might have seen him across the way, he was executive editor. He talked about having seen it back when he was executive editor for 2001 to 2003. He talked about having understood that, and he talked about it a lot, but he wasn't around long enough to do anything about it. It really began when Dean Baquet, there's a lot of New Orleans sort of connections here, I'm realizing, became executive editor in 2014, I think.
I mean, one thing that's remarkable is sort of his steadfastness. And you get that you have an interview, I think, with his son who succeeded him, who talked about him never, ever bringing work home and never complaining. And you have these, various meltdown scenes when every executive editor is sort of going through his or her trial by fire. And Arthur comes down to that person's desk and says, you did nothing wrong, it's just your time.
Right.
And yet to take on the burden that he took on for all those years and not to have his son pick up on any of that really seems to be both remarkable parenting, but someone who had maybe a broader eyes on a horizon that some people couldn't see.
I think it's a really good point. I don't know whether Arthur Jr. ever really thought that out. I think he just kind of did it. I think in a lot of ways he was trying. His father was also the publisher of the New York Times. I mean, everyone, right? And I think he was trying in some ways not to be his father, who I think was more about bringing stuff home and defining the Sulzbergers by the paper. But at the end of the day, the Sulzberger family, which are through line of this book, they define themselves by the New York Times. And I think that one of the reasons the New York Times has been successful as a journalistic and a business enterprise over the years is because it's a family enterprise. Like the last one left, I think, of a major newspaper, and the family's name and reputation is devoted to it and invested in it. And I think that's one of the reasons why the paper has continued to improve and continue to put money into its news product. Arthur Jr., sorry, there's so many Sulzbergers here, the main publisher that I'm talking about, had a very, this sort of line he has was, it's not your fault, it's just your time, which you would tell executive editors that were upset. At the same time, when he needed to do it, he would force out people who needed to be forced out.
So I'm going to prod you a little bit more on those conflicts. This passage. The Times would always turn to its greatest journalists when it came time to select the executive editor. Yet journalists are by their nature self-reliant, secretive, insecure, competitive, sensitive, and suspicious. They have sprawling egos and high self-regard. Those are fine qualities for a correspondent, but perhaps not for someone charged with managing an organization teeming with egos, talent, daily conflicts, and drama under such scrutiny by its readers, its employees, and by the world.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's this weird tradition at the Times and at other papers, not so much anymore, that you take your best correspondent, right, your best reporter, and make him or her your executive editor. And 20 years ago, it made no sense. I mean, that's too strong. it was a problematic kind of decision for all the reasons that you just read. Even more so today when there's more of an emphasis on executive editors getting involved in the business side of things in a way that was once never would have happened. It would have been shunned upon in terms of figuring out ways to reach reader, expand readership, cooperate with the business side. But it's just the sort of thing that you want to have your most prestigious journalists as the face of the paper, right? So all these names in the book: A. Rosenthal, Max Frankel, Joe Lelyveld, right? Howell Raines, Jill Abramson, Bill Keller, Dean Baquet. They're all extremely accomplished journalists. I mean, they won Pulitzers. I mean, I'd give anything to be as good as any of them as just a pure writer. That does not necessarily mean they're the best managers in the world. I mean, I don't think they would even dispute that. Some of them was. I think Dean Baquet certainly was, but some of the other ones not so much. And I think that's what fueled a lot of the narrative that I wrote here.
Why don't we talk through what each one brought?
Sure.
Because I think that, the paper you see today is really the accumulation of all of them. I mean, Abe was the 5-part paper. Max was what?
So when Max Frankel, so Abe Rosenthal was, I would say legendary, brilliant journalist, absolutely would not survive 5 minutes in this environment. He was a bully, he was sexist, he was, I don't want to say racist because I guess that's a little loaded, but he wasn't great on that issue. And, when he was finally forced out politely by Arthur Jr.'s father, Punch, Abe did not want to leave. He was replaced by Max Frankel. And Max Frankel was a longtime former Washington bureau chief, Moscow correspondent, really distinguished guy. And his main sort of charge from the executive editor, from the publisher, Punch Sulzberger, was to make the New York Times a happy place again. And he did that in a lot of ways, not every way. And he also did things like change the paper's coverage of AIDS coverage, because the AIDS epidemic was breaking out in New York at the time, and Rosenthal just squashed most coverage of that at all. And made it an easier place for gay reporters to work. And began the process, or I should actually say, attempted the process, not that successfully, of diversifying the newsroom. But I think that he ran a very steady ship, and he righted it, and he was a good executive editor. I mean, I think it was the paper was really solid during his tenure.
And then Joe Lelyveld, and it seemed in the book that what Joe did was actually empower writers.
Yeah.
That it was more elevating writing over, dowdy editors who would take the life out of everything.
Yeah, I think Lelyveld kind of hated editors. In many ways, Joe died, I guess 3 months ago. I wrote a piece arguing that he was the last of the great print editors, which is a good thing or a bad thing. He resisted digital in a way that his successors, Hal Raines, Bill Keller, Jill Abramson pretty much, and Dean, did not. I mean, there's this one great scene where, even just the sort of the appearance of the paper, he was talking to some photographers, and they were like, "Can we get some more pictures in here?" And the paper looks better. It's more readable. This is even before digital, and he's like, "Better luck with the next guy." But he just really believed in it, and he also, and I think this is very interesting. This was a time of like Monica Lewinsky and Princess Di, and more of a move to the kind of what's the right word? Sort of popular, we would say now click-worthy coverage. And Joe really resisted that stuff as much as possible. And I think, he has this great line where he's talking to me, and he had to make the decision to publish the details of Monica Lewinsky's dress, and you have to Google it, so I'm not going to tell you what it is if you don't remember. But it's kind of seedy. And he says, "This is great. I get to make the decision about Monica Lewinsky's dress," and Abe Rosenthal got the Pentagon papers. And in this sort of droll kind of happy way he was. But he was a very, I think in many ways he was a great executive editor, last of a type.
They're all, in fact, you have a scene where Max Frankel is talking to Hal Raines about how you run for executive editor.
Right.
You've been a political reporter for a long, long time.
As was Howell, yeah.
Did you treat this almost as a campaign book? Because it really is a political undertaking.
Yeah, so I tried to bring whatever kind of knowledge, expertise, quote unquote, I don't want to overuse that word, in understanding what was going on in the newsroom. I didn't want to turn it into a horse race, So it informed it. Hopefully it didn't frame it that way, but that is a way to understand it. And again, many of these executive editors, Howell Raines being a perfect example, were incredibly accomplished political reporters. So we look at the world the same way. So when Max Frankel, and Max Frankel was too, right? When Max Frankel said to him, he understood this is very much a political kind of battle. But that's more for how to advance in the paper as opposed to how to run the paper.
But do you think they were sort of running against each other? Because wasn't Howell a reaction? I mean, Howell was running against Joe.
Right.
Basically. And maybe you can tell as we go through the pantheon of Times editors and what each represented to you.
I mean, I think, so Joe was, as I said, was kind of the last great print editor. Howell came in and said, in applying for the job and talking to Arthur Sulzberger Jr., at that time the relatively new publisher, I think the quote was, if you want more of the same, stick with my rival, a man named Bill Keller.
Right track, wrong track.
Right, right. But if you want to change things, and he said, I think the paper needs to change. And, I think that Howell Raines saw at the time that the way the world was going. And he might have been a little harsh about the quality of the paper at the time, but it definitely needed to change, and he saw that. And I think he understood that Arthur Sulzberger Jr. was looking for that. He was younger, he was more adventurous, and he was trying to put his mark on the paper.
And then how it all kind of exploded.
Yeah, there were two main issues with Howell. One was the Iraq coverage and the need for the paper to write an Iraq editor's note.
Where the paper was too credulous about
weapons of mass destruction. I write a lot about it. This Judy Miller, and and the other thing was Jason Blair, who was this young reporter, came on young, and a black reporter, which is kind of relevant, but not 100%. We can talk about that. Who just made stuff up and flew under the radar and just never got caught. In part because I don't think the paper ever considered the fact that somebody would systematically just make up stuff, which is what Jason did. And, the sort of confluence of those events, I think, and the fact that Howell Raines really tore up the newsroom, was really trying to change things, created enough of an atmosphere of dissatisfaction that when there was an uprising in the newsroom, which there was, he couldn't survive it, and Arthur had to ask him to leave. And I think that was that was a really reluctant decision on Arthur's part. I think Arthur and Howell were really close, and I think Arthur was heartbroken to let him go, and I think it was, I don't know, I think there's the scene in there where Arthur says something to Howell at lunch, mourning takes a year, or 2 years. We could argue about how long that is, but a year, and he was still heartbroken about it.
When you were mentioning Abe versus Joe and coverage of AIDS, I mean, one thing that does
Abe versus Howell.
Abe, One thing that
Abe versus Max.
Sorry. Yeah. One thing that does run through the book is that basically every major civil rights struggle of the last 25 years takes place in this place, whether it is over race, whether it is over gay rights, whether it is over gender equality. And the paper succeeds and fails in different ways. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the race one is a good, let's do the AIDS one first, then the race one. The AIDS one, Max comes along. So Abe Rosenthal, I found stuff, when I was going through the archives at the New York Public Library, and I found Abe Rosenthal kept a private diary because he was thinking about writing a memoir. This is a little bit tangential, so just forgive me if it's too weird. So my father was a publisher, Herb Nagourney, and I realized from going through the archives that he had gone to Abe Rosenthal because I found these letters suggesting that he write this memoir. So Abe started keeping a diary for a memoir that never got run. It was a great idea on my father's part. It never happened. Helped his son 40 years later, God willing. So anyway, one thing that I found in there was Abe talking very specifically in ways that sort of betrayed his homophobia. And again, I use words like that really advisedly. And he talks about gay people in the newsroom forming a conspiracy. I think the word was conspiracy or clique or something like that. And there was a real life effect of that in that the AIDS epidemic was breaking out in New York. That was really the epicenter of it there, in San Francisco and LA to a lesser extent. And the paper just didn't cover it. I mean, the first front page story about AIDS wasn't until, I think, 1983. And that reflected, I think, Abe Rosenthal's discomfort with the topic. When Max Franco came in, I came across a memo he wrote to somebody saying, I want to get, I think he said, don't hold me to the exact number, it was in the book, 5 reporters assigned on this. I don't want history to look back at us and think that we blew this incredibly important story. And you can see the
on
coverage
its doorstep. I mean, on the streets of New York.
On the streets of New York, it's all around them. That's where people are dying, right? So, I mean, I think that's one really good example. And I think the paper, not only in terms of that, covering the issue, but the newsroom itself became much more embracing. I'm going a little bit out of order. I'm talking about women, right? So in 1974 and 1975, women filed a gender discrimination suit against the Times because there was abundant evidence that women were underpaid and were not given the same positions as men. I tell the story through a woman named Betsy Wade, who was I don't know if you ever came across her. She was a copy editor. Everyone I talk about her as like one of the finest copy editors that had ever existed at the Times. She talked to me before she died about working in the newsroom and how intense it was to be the only woman in the newsroom after 6 o'clock, and how men really treated her with disdain. And then she put her name first on this lawsuit, right? And she was in the elevator one day, and this really senior executive named Cindy Grusin gets in the elevator with her and looks at her and says, if she tells the story, I hope you realize we're not in the practice of promoting people who sue us. So she became the editor of the Frugal Traveler, I think, right? Which is a great column, I think. I mean, I read it all the time, but that was not where she would have ended up. But there's an important lesson here. The Times, they might dispute that. They essentially lost that lawsuit.
Yep.
I mean, I think if you talk to their lawyers, they'd say, no, we didn't really lose it, but they did. And there were a ton of women who came into the newsroom in senior positions, Anna Quinlan, Susan Chira, Soma Golden, who told me that it was because of that lawsuit. That's an example of an advancement in the newsroom because of that lawsuit. Now, it took too long. There was not a woman executive editor at that paper until 2010, right? And that was the first one. So there's still a lot of ways to go.
And race was harder.
A mess.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because, you approach these, or at least I approach this project with certain preconceptions that I'm willing to have smashed. And one of them was that the paper was always really bad on race, because it sure was, at least the effect of it. But I came across a speech that Punch Sulzberger gave in 1969, where he talked about how upset he was with the lack of diversity. I don't even think they were using that word back then in the newsroom, and he wants to change it. Now, did it change it? No, it didn't. And it has to do with a very complicated New York Times environment. And, this is tricky stuff to write about. But some of the editors would argue it's because we believe in quality first, and we're not going to make any concessions just for the sake of diversity. The problem is that the way they often describe quality is who graduates from Harvard, right? They had these old-fashioned sort of rules that kept the newsroom really white for a long time. I think that the publisher now, this is a little bit out of my time frame, the paper has really changed on it. They're much more aggressive about that because the paper really failed, sometimes sometimes even as they tried, but sometimes because there was just resistance to it at diversifying the newsroom in a way they needed to.
So, I mean, the paper does seem to have in its DNA this ability to really screw up and bounce back. And you tell that around Wen Ho Lee, which is an investigation that went awry. You tell that around Jason Blair, and it doesn't do anything for a while. Something explodes, and then there is this great moment of soul searching, normally culminating in an editor's note, a giant mea culpa, and then the paper kind of learns something. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
You forgot the denial stage.
Oh, I was thinking.
But I do think that's true. I think that is really true. And I think, boy, this is going to sound a little bit, I guess, Pollyannish. But I do think that people who work there, for the most part, have a real clear idea of what the paper's mission is and are honored to serve it. Now, at the same time, they have egos and their ambition, and they make mistakes and they screw up. But the other reason for that, what you're talking about, though, is a little bit off the example that you use, is that there is an enormous amount of talent at the paper. So if you have, I kept coming across examples of this. So if you have a reporter or an editor who just screws up or comes to work drunk or doesn't, come, there's like all these people ready to step in who are better than any journalist that you and I have ever met. I'm exaggerating a little bit. And I think that's part of the luxury of the New York Times. And I think that is also what makes the Times complacent at times, because they realize that, oh, we don't have to worry about this, that, we have all these people who can do this. And also that people just assume that we're always right and that we're best, which obviously is not true anymore. That's one of the big changes that's taken place.
And I think we'll go to questions in a couple of minutes. Cover a few other things. It also struck me that this is a book about business innovation. Because there are times when, newspapers, news organizations are challenged, times when the Times was kind of flat on its back.
Absolutely.
And then found a way to rebound. And there was this one scene that I wanted to read because I think it's important. It's about Eliot Spitzer and the governor of New York, who was caught in an unhappy prostitution scandal.
As opposed to a happy one.
And this is it's a scene with Jill Abramson where Spitzer is about to go public with the story, and the Times wants to beat him. And so the Times puts the story up on the website instead of waiting for the paper. And as Adam wrote, "Hit it," Abramson said, and with that, the story was on the homepage. The affirmation of that decision came with stunning speed as the image of the Times homepage, "Spitzer is linked to prostitution ring," read the headline, flickered across television screens across the newsroom. It was a lesson. There was no such thing as a deadline anymore, no incentive to wait and risk losing an exclusive story. There should be no more talk about the website scooping the print edition or discussion of holding an exclusive story from the web until after it had appeared in print. The website was becoming as effective a platform distributing news as the front page of the Times. And that seemed to me to be one of those moments where the Times begins to pick itself back up again.
What's amazing about that, you're absolutely right, was that actually happened a couple times. They had to keep relearning that lesson, right? Because again, you always kind of default back into this old school, practice of like, well, write the paper and edit it, and then we'll put it in the paper in the morning. And like, people there were realizing that was crazy. And that was a moment that showed that was crazy. And I think that was a turning point because there was less turning back. But that lesson had been learned before. There was this long struggle that I came across in just going through old documents. There were people who saw the future. And I would argue that I don't know how much he thought it through, but Sulzberger Jr. was one of them. But there are other people that you don't even hear about now, like Rich Meisler or Martin Nietzenholz, who realized where the world was going, but there were also people that were resisting it. Abe Rosenthal talks about, I can see where people will get their news, on a computer. This is years ago. But I can't imagine them ever reading it on a screen. Yeah, right. And then you have, the paper is trying all this sort of innovative stuff. And Max Frankel is firing off these memos to the publisher saying, this is madness. This thing where I think everyone knows what a fax is, right? Yeah. That you're faxing out the best stories every day. But overall, there was this group of people who saw where the paper was going and pushed it that direction. And there were turning points like that. But I still would argue it wasn't until, 2016, almost 10 years later, 6 years later, where the paper really moved into a full digital paper, which I think it is now. It is completely a digital paper.
And that sort of gets to New Orleans' favorite son, Dean Baquet.
Right.
Who seems, and you should tell me, but would seem, in your view, from reading the book, to be the best of the executive editors because he was the one to recognize that you had to work with the business side. Yeah,
Dean came after Jill Abramson, and Jill, I think Jill would tell you this if she was there. She was not cut out for that job. I'm not disputing her journalism credentials at all, but she hated being executive editor, and I think it showed. And part of it was that the definition of what executive editor was not what it was when Joe Lelyveld was, or for that matter, when Hal was. It was much more, there's more, business stuff. And Dean Baquet comes along after Arthur fires Jill, second time he has had to do that. And I think that Dean is more of a guy who understands, first of all, he is a journalist, I think an excellent journalist. He understands that you could not say no. The title of that chapter, which I think he might have hated, was Diplomat, but it's true. He just realized he would say yes to stuff he didn't understand. Like, sometimes if you're in these digital meetings and people are talking about stuff and you're like, well, what? And he would just say yes. Yeah. And I think that really, really, really made a difference. And I think this is also going back to what you were saying, again, about executive editors being political, and political is not a bad thing, but he understood that's what the publisher wanted in a way that I think Joe Edmondson either didn't understand or didn't want to understand. And he realized that's where the paper was going, and therefore he would step aside or encourage all kinds of changes. And I think that he was, I would argue he was the right editor for the right time. I think he was transformational for that reason. That he's what the paper needed, and it's a large reason, not the only reason. There are a lot of people there who saw the future and did really important stuff, but he's one of the reasons why the paper is, at least right now, the financial success that it is.
So you've got 39 chapters. What's
that many?
It doesn't.
I kept it under 40.
Feels like 10. But what is chapter 40? What's the next? What's the next big cliff for the Times?
So I think, one thing I learned about this, which is going to be obvious to a lot of people, especially historians in this audience, is, you really need distance to not only to get people to be candid with you, as I was talking about before, but to really understand what was going on. So if I was doing the next book, which I don't think I'll be able to, just because I'm too old, but maybe I will, I don't know. You need time. The themes, though, are already clear to me, right? Or some of the themes. One is, this idea that you're now a subscription-based, primarily paper, means you're more subject to the whims of your readers, right? So you see it now, readers are upset about our coverage over Gaza. They might threaten their subscriptions. Yeah. That's a big thing. How do you balance that off? How do you balance off the impetus to put stuff on the homepage that gets clicks? Taylor Swift, great story. Does she belong on the front page of the New York Times? I don't know. We can talk about it later. Versus like what's going on in, a good example, stories on water in the West. Really important, really boring, but really important. They're a big deal. So I think that's a big part of it. And then the other part of it, and you see this popping through all the time, is how do you deal with a newsroom that is of a different complexion? What I mean by that is there's more people who are in technology, reader development, presenting the news in the incredibly sophisticated way they present the news, that don't necessarily share the standards. The standards is not the right word. The morals that some of us, morals is definitely not the right word, but just, what we consider to be the right way to approach news. So there's much more pressure for the paper to have a political point of view. And I think that is what Joe Kahn, the current executive editor, and A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher, is now wrestling through. And my bet is that it's going to be resolved one way or another, 10 years, less, and that's a big theme.
It's hard. The broader it gets, the more difficult it becomes to have a culture. Once upon a time when you were a copy boy, you were trained and you worked your way up, and there was supervision at every corner. If you're coming in through video, if you're coming in through Wirecutter, there are a set of perfectly valid ethics. They just aren't always in alignment. Just on your political hat, what's going to happen with this campaign? How's the paper going to cover it?
I think the paper is still struggling to figure out how to cover Trump, and I think it's doing a better job than it did in 2016. I'm extremely sympathetic. It's like we haven't had a candidate before who just routinely lies and I think is arguably a threat. I'm just going to quote Liz Cheney here, a threat to the Republic. So I think the paper's trying to figure out how to do it. The other thing is this is a weird campaign in that it's at once kind of weirdly boring. Let me finish that sentence before people. And the most consequential campaign in 100 years.
And the floor could fall out at any moment.
But the thing is, like, we know who the candidates are going to be. It's a rerun of these. So just talking journalistically, how do you figure out how to cover it? It's a rerun of 2020. But the stakes are really high. I did a panel before where I questioned Maggie Haberman. They're doing a great series of stories called 2025, taking a look at what a Trump second term would be. That's what I think we need to do. Like, I plead guilty. I'm doing horse race stuff too. Oh, Biden's old. We know he's old. Trump's old. But that's really the kind of stuff that really matters. And I think at the end of the day, that is what's going to distinguish the Times as opposed to other papers in terms of how to cover this race.
Since this is Bookfest, essential reading on newspapers, fiction, nonfiction, best books.
Yeah, it's like Ezra Klein here, right? I'm going to go.
Oh, really?
I'm rereading Gay Talese's book now, and that damn book. We wrote it in '67. Anyone remember? Yeah, that damn book. It still meets its moment. It is still a great book. It shows how much the Times has changed, like the self-regard of the Times has changed, how male it was, but it still was a very important revealing book of the way journalism works, and that's what I would read.
Novels, movies, TV shows?
Okay, novels, I'm going to get the name wrong. Killer Moon.
Uh-huh.
And I looked at that and I was like, Jesus, I wish I was as good as that guy. He's got my agent too, Kathy Robbins. David Grady, he's fantastic.
And about papers?
Newspaper?
About newspapering.
Yeah, it was just amazing, right? About newspapering, I can't remember a novel I've read recently.
Okay, a TV show that you love about papers?
I haven't had
movies?
a chance to see Girls on the Bus. So
okay.
That's not,
Okay, well
I
then
guess,
maybe we get some suggestions
Slaughterhouse
from...
doesn't count.
There's Scoop.
Slow Horses, sorry.
Why don't we, maybe we'll get some suggestions from those gathered, and I don't know if there's a microphone that is... Yeah, please come on up.
Coming. Here we are.
Hi.
Hi. You spoke earlier about the Times not being political. It's interesting because I was thinking about what was driving Whitewater. Was that not political?
What I was talking about, I hope I was clear, was I didn't want to just think about the executive editors as being political animals.
No. I think we're talking about Trump, how to handle things.
Okay.
And I was going to say, because the Times, reading the Times, this is like what, it was early '90s. It was all this money in search of a story. Who was driving that, and what was that about? Who was mad at someone? I mean,
yeah, the Whitewater story. I mean, I don't even get into this in my book, but I think they thought they had a really good investigative story that just didn't really work out as well as they thought, which happens, But I don't think news decisions are made for a variety of different reasons, and I don't think it's like because somebody decided to get Bill Clinton. I don't think.
Why don't we go to that side?
How do you think the Times will? Do you think the Times will prevail in its argument against AI in using its content?
I'm going to dodge that question only because I'm not a lawyer. I will say I kind of hope it does, but I don't really have the expertise to give you the answer you'd like. But I hope so. I mean, it's a real threat. It is a real threat.
Sir?
I want you to reflect upon the tension between the editorial and the business side of the paper that you allude to in the editorial, the new editorial person. Why is it necessary for us to see all the Bulgari ads in the paper? All the luxury goods that are displayed on the advertising. I know it's money; it comes on in. But would you take an ad from anybody that comes in just to?
No, the paper has an
Particularly the luxury goods. That's
Yeah.
the part that always drives me crazy when it hits my, I'm trying to read and I'm distracted by the ads a little bit. I'm wondering
Right.
why we have to sell so much luxury goods to a audience that you think is going to be a very well-informed and
I will say that I think that print advertising isn't as lucrative a source of revenue as it once was, and at this point, I don't think the Times is going to say no to everything. But I know the ads you're talking about, and obviously they see that as their market, right? If you look at the T magazine, do you get that? You ever see that thick magazine, right? It's filled with stuff like, I'm looking at this like, who buys this stuff? But if they're paying for the ads, my feeling is like as long as they're not like advertising something, you know.
But in social
Yeah.
media, we're very concerned about, I don't want to put an ad into social media that's going to have a Nazi.
Yeah, I don't think I think
You know, the Times every day is publishing, we got to do better for the poor.
Right.
While we're selling luxury.
I understand what you're saying, but I do think to use your Nazi thing, which is the easiest thing to make it, I don't think the Times would like accept an ad for the Nazi party. I do think of something like that. They're not really thinking, okay, we're, you know, our editorial page is talking about lifting up the poor while we're advertising like $25,000 watches. All right. But I see your point.
Sir.
Barry Weiss has written a lot about the overly woke culture and
Right.
the whole Tom Cotton piece.
Yep.
Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, this is what I was talking about before in terms of it's going to take time to figure out how this is going on, where this is ending up. I don't think these issues are resolved. And I think what happened with the Tom Cotton story, the rise of people in the newsroom, this intervention about what was appropriate to publish that led to the dismissal of James Bennett, the editorial page editor, you know, that's just something that the editor and the publishers going to have to try to figure out how to manage. I think they've sent signals saying it clearly is not appropriate, but you know, we're seeing it again with Gaza, right? There's a big uprising in the paper, all papers, about whether the Times is being too sympathetic to Israel or not tough enough on Netanyahu, and it's just something that they have to deal with. It's like, this is where there's a generational thing. Like, I can never imagine, you know, going in there and saying, you know, taking a position on that war or even on the Cotton thing and saying, you know, you must fire him. But people have different views on that now. I think it's really hard to be executive editor of the New York Times right now. I mean, it was always hard, but now it's really hard.
Sir?
Hi, my question is in a similar vein to the
Yeah.
previous one, not just with Barry Weiss, but also it just seems that the New York Times has gone from just being a paper for intellectuals and educated to basically just being a democratic paper. And you had mentioned Elliot Spitz, right? And we saw with what happened with Hunter Biden's laptop. Do you think that if a story like with Elliot Spitz came out now, the New York Times would even cover it or try to hide it? And can they recover from this, or are they just going to become a democratic paper?
I mean, I think they are really. I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm not in the newsroom. I'm not an editor. I don't have a firsthand. I feel very reported and researched on the earlier period, not this period. But I do think that the paper, just looking at it, if it comes across a scandal or anything like that involving a Democratic governor, president, whatever, they're going to run it. And I think that if we had people from the Biden White House here right now who I think are pretty upset about the way the paper's covered the age issue, they would disagree. I don't think that the paper would, right, if they had another Elliot Spitzer situation, would pull back and not report it. Or for that matter, Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, right? Same thing. I don't think they would pull back and not report it.
Only because you were asking for suggestions, I would offer the movie Ace in the Hole by Billy Wilder.
Okay,
Oh.
thank you. Thank you. Actually, that's really, yeah. I never am able to come up with that stuff. I think when Ezra Klein does that, he always gives his interviewees a chance.
A little
to go,
chance
yeah.
to. I just assume you're so well read and
Yeah.
cover culture and do everything so beautifully that you have a list. But we can come back. We can take emails and.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
What one thing I can ask you is like,
Yeah.
what's the key to writing fast?
A deadline. I mean, seriously, it's like, I don't know. I'm working on something now that has to do with somebody. I can't say for the obvious reason. It's not sensitive, but having to do with somebody being prepared when somebody dies, and like,
Yeah.
I can't get myself to start working on it. Like, he could die any day. The piece got to be ready to go, and like, but you just need a deadline to get stuff done. Now, how I got that book took 7 years. I guess the publisher, I mean, they never really came down on me. I guess that was more an imposed kind of deadline. So,
You also, let's talk for a second, since we have 45 seconds, about the culture of the Times. You actually
Yeah.
came from USA Today.
I did.
And really
I did.
made your name there in a very different culture. So you can sort
Yeah.
of undertake the cultural arbitrage. If you were to sum up in the final 30 seconds what the culture of the New York Times is, what would you say?
you know, I think that some people might not agree because you're assuming I'm going to say, people will assume I'm going to say it's this cutthroat, killer, you know. I don't find that. It's like I said before, I find it it's a culture of brilliant overachievers, incredibly neurotic, insecure people who wake up every day thinking I'm a failure and then turn out like a story that wins a Pulitzer. And that's just the atmosphere of the place. And it's competitive and a little bit crazy and like either you love it or you don't. I love that lots of people are like, what is this Michigan crazy place?
Can't top that. Adam Nagourney, everyone. The Times.
Thank you.
Wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.